On a desolate wagon trail in Montana Territory, 1887, 9-year-old Junie Ray walked alone with nothing but a small cloth bundle and her mother's worn Bible. Her parents had succumbed to fever during the brutal winter, and the distant relatives, who'd reluctantly taken her in, had driven her out to this remote stretch of cattle country in their wagon and simply abandoned her there. They claimed the territorial authorities would find her eventually, but Junie had learned not to trust adults with their empty promises. What she didn't know was that Cole Maddox, the wealthiest and most feared cattle baron in 3 territories, was about to ride down that very trail on his black stallion during the season's worst thunderstorm. Cole had been a broken man since, losing his own daughter to consumption 2 years prior. His vast ranch empire nothing more than a monument to grief and bitter memories. But sometimes Providence works in mysterious ways. When Cole's horse reared at the sight of the small figure stumbling through the driving rain, neither of them realized they were about to discover exactly what they'd lost all hope of ever finding again. Could a hardened cattle king and a forsaken child really forge the bond that both their wounded hearts desperately craved? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The storm had been building all afternoon across the vast Montana Territory, dark clouds rolling in from the western peaks like a judgment upon the land. Cole Maddox pulled his black wool coat tighter against the wind as he guided his stallion, Thunder, along the familiar cattle trail that marked the eastern boundary of his empire. At 42, Cole commanded respect and fear in equal measure throughout 3 territories. His Circle M brand burned into the hides of over 10,000 head of cattle that grazed across 100,000 acres of prime rangeland. But wealth and power meant nothing to a man whose heart had been buried alongside his 8-year-old daughter 2 summers past. Sarah had been everything to him after his wife Rebecca died, birthing her. For 8 precious years, that golden-haired little girl had filled the vast emptiness of the ranch house with laughter and music, her tiny fingers dancing across the keys of the imported piano he'd bought her for her 7th birthday. She'd been his companion on morning rides, his dinner partner at the long mahogany table, his reason for building something lasting in this harsh frontier land. Then consumption took her, just as it had taken her mother's sister back in St. Louis. Just as it seemed to take every gentle thing in this unforgiving country. The music box still sat on the mantelpiece in his study, a delicate porcelain ballerina that pirouetted to amazing grace when you wound the tiny key. Sarah had cranked it every night before bed, watching the dancer spin as she hummed along in her sweet, reedy voice. Cole hadn't touched it since the day they'd lowered her small coffin into the hard Montana ground. Some evenings, when the wind was just right, he could swear he heard those familiar notes drifting through the empty hallways of his home. His ranch foreman, Jim Hawthorne, had suggested more than once that Cole might consider remarrying. Perhaps finding himself a good woman from back east who could bring life to the house again. The territorial newspaper from Helena regularly carried advertisements from ladies seeking correspondence with established gentlemen. But Cole couldn't imagine another woman's laughter in Sarah's room, couldn't bear the thought of replacing what had been perfect and irreplaceable. So he'd thrown himself into the business with the single-minded determination that had built his empire in the first place. He drove harder bargains, expanded his holdings, added another 1,000 head to his herds each season. His ranch hands respected his fair wages and honest dealing, but they also knew better than to expect warmth from a man who seemed carved from the same granite as the mountains that ringed his property. The few social obligations he couldn't avoid, the quarterly Cattlemen's Association meetings in Helena, the annual Territorial Day celebrations, he endured with grim politeness, deflecting the well-meaning questions about his solitary life with curt nods and early departures. Dr. Patterson, who'd delivered Sarah and later been unable to save her, still made the monthly ride out from Sweetwater Creek to check on Cole's health and spirits. More often than not, he found both lacking. A man wasn't meant to live alone with his ghosts, Doc had said just last month, settling his considerable bulk into the leather chair across from Cole's desk. Sarah wouldn't want you withering away in this mausoleum you've made of her memory. But what did Doc Patterson know about loss? His own children were grown and thriving. His wife still hummed while she baked bread. His house still rang with the sounds of living. Easy enough to prescribe companionship when you'd never had your heart carved out with a dull knife and left to bleed in private. Thunder snorted and sidestepped as a particularly fierce gust of wind sent tumbleweeds skittering across their path. The stallion was getting skittish, sensing the storm's approach with animal instinct. Cole should have turned for home an hour ago, but something had drawn him farther along the trail today, a restlessness that even his usual solitary ride hadn't been able to cure. Martha Henley, his housekeeper, would have dinner waiting when he returned. She'd been with the family since before Sarah was born, a widow herself who understood the particular silence of grief. She kept the house running with quiet efficiency, never mentioning the closed door of Sarah's room or the way. Cole sometimes stood at the parlor window for long minutes, staring at nothing. If anyone deserved better than his brooding presence, it was Martha, but she stayed out of loyalty or pity. He'd never asked which. The wind was picking up now, carrying the smell of rain and something else, something that made Thunder's ears prick forward with nervous attention. Cole had learned to trust his horse's instincts over the years. In country where a man's survival might depend on reading the signs that others missed, a good horse could mean the difference between making it home and becoming another cautionary tale. That's when he saw her. At first, she was just a dark shape against the lighter brown of the trail, small enough that he might have mistaken her for a wounded animal, if not for the unmistakably human way she moved. As Thunder carried him closer, the shape resolved into impossible details. A child, alone, stumbling along the deserted wagon road with the uncertain gait of someone pushed beyond exhaustion. Cole reined in his horse, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were telling him. No child should be out here, miles from the nearest settlement, with a storm bearing down like the wrath of God. His first thought was that she must be lost, separated from a wagon train or homestead family. But as he studied the small figure more carefully, noting the deliberate direction of her movement and the bundle clutched against her chest, he realized this wasn't a child who had wandered away from safety. This was a child who had been abandoned to find her own. The realization hit him like a physical blow, stirring emotions he'd kept carefully buried for 2 years. Against every instinct of self-preservation that had kept him safe in his grief, Cole felt something crack open in his chest, a space that had been sealed tight since the day he'd stood beside a small grave and promised himself he'd never risk loving anything that much again. Thunder danced beneath him, eager to move, to flee the approaching storm and return to the warm stable that awaited. Cole's practical mind urged the same course. Whatever tragedy had brought this child to this desolate place, it wasn't his responsibility. He had his own ghosts to tend, his own careful distances to maintain. But his hands remained steady on the reins, and his eyes stayed fixed on the small figure ahead. And for the first time in 2 years, Cole Maddox found himself wondering if sometimes Providence worked in ways too mysterious for a broken man to understand. Cole urged Thunder forward at a careful walk, his heart hammering against his ribs in a rhythm he hadn't felt since the night Sarah took her final breath. The child ahead seemed oblivious to his approach, her small form swaying with each step, as if she might collapse at any moment. As he drew closer, he could make out more details that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. She couldn't be more than 9 or 10 years old, with dark hair plastered to her head by the wind, and what might have been tears. Her dress, if it could still be called that, was torn and stained, patched in places with fabric that didn't match. She carried a small bundle pressed against her chest like a lifeline, and with each gust of wind she stumbled, but somehow found the strength to keep walking. The first fat raindrops began to fall as Cole brought thunder to a halt 20 feet behind her. For a moment, he simply sat in his saddle, watching this impossible sight and fighting every protective instinct that 2 years of careful isolation had taught him to suppress. This child was someone else's tragedy, someone else's responsibility. He had learned the hard way that caring led to loss, that love was just another word for the pain that came when God decided to take away everything that mattered. But even as his mind formed these thoughts, his hand was moving to the silver pocket, watch in his vest, the one engraved with Sarah's birth date that he'd carried every day since her death. He pulled it out, intending to check the time, to convince himself he needed to hurry home before the storm hit in earnest. Instead, he found himself staring at the motionless hands, frozen at 3:47, the exact moment 2 years ago when Doc Patterson had pronounced his daughter beyond earthly help. The watch had stopped working that day, and Cole had never bothered to have it repaired. Some broken things, he'd reasoned, were meant to stay broken as reminders of what happened when you loved too much. But now, sitting in his saddle with rain beginning to dampen his shoulders, watching a child who clearly had nowhere else to go, something shifted in Cole's chest. Maybe it was the way she held that bundle like it contained her entire world. Maybe it was the determined set of her small shoulders despite her obvious exhaustion. Or maybe it was simply that after 2 years of existing rather than living, he'd stumbled upon someone whose need was greater than his fear. "Child," he called out, his voice rough from disuse and emotion. She spun around so quickly she nearly lost her footing, her eyes wide with the particular terror of someone who had learned not to trust strangers. Cole's heart clenched as he took in her face. Hollow cheeks that spoke of hunger, eyes too old for such a young face, and a wariness that no child should have to carry. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. The wealthy cattle, Baron on his fine horse, and the abandoned waif clutching her meager possessions. The rain was falling harder now, and thunder shifted restlessly beneath him, but Cole found he couldn't look away from those enormous eyes that seemed to hold depths of sorrow he recognized all too well. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, dismounting slowly, so as not to frighten her further. "My name is Cole Maddox. What's yours?" She backed up a step, her grip tightening on her bundle. "Junie Ray," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Junie Ray Maddox now, I guess, if you're fixing to help me." The casual way she adopted his surname, as if names were fluid things that could be changed with circumstances, hit Cole like a physical blow. In her young mind, apparently, taking his name was simply the price of whatever protection he might offer. The thought of what experiences had taught her such pragmatic survival strategies made his hands clench into fists. "Where are your people, Junie Ray?" he asked gently, crouching down to her level despite the mud beginning to form beneath their feet. Her chin lifted with a pride that would have been admirable if it weren't so heartbreaking. "Don't have any people, not any more." She shifted the bundle in her arms, and Cole caught a glimpse of worn leather that might have been a Bible. "Had some relations took me in after Mama and Papa died of the fever, but they said they couldn't keep me no more. Said the territorial authorities would find me a place." Cole's jaw tightened. He'd seen enough abandoned children in frontier towns to know how that story usually ended. The territorial authorities were spread thin across vast distances, and orphaned children often fell through the cracks, ending up in workhouses or worse, if they were lucky enough to survive at all. "How long have you been walking?" he asked. "Since yesterday morning, I reckon. Maybe longer. Time gets funny when you're real tired." She swayed on her feet, and Cole instinctively reached out to steady her, but she flinched away from his touch. "I can keep going, mister. I don't need nothing from nobody." The words were brave, but her body told a different story. Even as she spoke, her knees began to buckle, and only sheer determination kept her upright. Cole could see she was running on nothing but willpower now, and willpower had its limits, even in the strongest souls. The storm was building overhead, the kind of late spring tempest that could turn deadly in minutes out here in the open country. Already the temperature was dropping, and the wind carried the bite of possible hail. No one, let alone a child, could survive a night in this weather without shelter. Cole looked at his pocket watch again, still frozen at that terrible moment 2 years ago. Then he made a decision that would change both their lives forever. 2 deliberate movements. He reached into his vest and pulled out the watch chain, letting the silver timepiece dangle in the wind and rain. Without ceremony, he snapped the chain and let the broken watch fall into the mud at their feet. "Sometimes," he said quietly, more to himself than to her, "a man has to stop living in the past and start moving toward tomorrow." Junie Ray stared at the discarded watch with confusion. "Mister, you just threw away a right fine timepiece." "It was broken anyway," Cole replied, standing and extending his hand to her. "How about we get you somewhere warm and dry before this? Storm gets worse? My ranch isn't far, and my housekeeper Martha makes the best beef stew in 3 territories." The child studied his face with the intensity of someone who had learned to read adult intentions for survival. Whatever she saw there must have convinced her, because after a moment's hesitation, she slipped her small, cold hand into his much larger one. "I don't suppose," she said with the careful politeness of someone trying not to impose, "you might have a spare corner where a person could sleep?" "I don't take up much room." The simple request, asked with such dignity despite her desperate circumstances, nearly undid him. Cole squeezed her hand gently and helped her toward Thunder, who stood waiting with patient understanding. "I reckon we can find you something better than a corner," he said, lifting her carefully onto the saddle before swinging up behind her. "Hold on tight now." As they rode toward his ranch with the storm chasing at their backs, Cole felt something he hadn't experienced in 2 long years, a sense of purpose beyond his own survival. The child in his arms was trust and vulnerability and need all wrapped in a package so small he could have carried her with one hand. And for the first time since he'd buried his daughter, Cole Maddox found himself thinking not about what he'd lost, but about what he might still have the chance to save. Behind them, abandoned in the mud, his broken pocket watch lay forgotten, as the rain washed away the last traces of the time when his heart had stopped beating. But ahead of them, carried safe in the circle of his arms, was a child who might just teach him how to let it start again. The Circle M ranch house rose from the Montana landscape like something from a fairy tale, at least to Junie Ray's exhausted eyes. 2 stories of solid timber and stone, with a wraparound porch that could have held her entire previous home twice over. Warm yellow light spilled from tall windows, and smoke curled invitingly from the massive stone chimney. She'd never seen anything so grand, so permanent, so unlike the succession of cramped cabins and lean-tos she'd called home throughout her short life. Cole felt her stiffen in his arms as they approached the hitching post near the front steps. "It's bigger than I thought it would be," she whispered, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been fear. "Houses are just wood and stone," he replied gently, dismounting and then lifting her down with careful hands. "It's the people inside that matter." Before they could reach the porch steps, the front door swung open to reveal Martha Henley, her grey hair escaping from its customary bun and her weathered face creased with worry. At 58, Martha had been with the Maddox family for 12 years, arriving as a young widow desperate for work and staying out of loyalty that had deepened into genuine affection. "Cole Maddox, I was beginning to think that storm had washed." "You clear to Canada," she began, then stopped short as her eyes took in the small figure beside him. "Sweet, merciful heaven, what have you brought home?" "This is Junie Ray," Cole said simply. "She needs a warm meal and a dry place to sleep." Martha's maternal instincts, dormant since Sarah's death, immediately took command. She was down the steps in seconds, her hands fluttering over Junie like a mother hen checking her chick. "Child, you're soaked through to the bone. How long have you been out in this weather?" Junie clutched her bundle tighter and shot a questioning look at Cole. When he nodded encouragingly, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "A day or 2, Ma'am. Maybe more. Time gets confused when you're walking. Walking, Martha's voice rose in indignation. Where were you walking from, honey? Martha, Cole interrupted gently. Questions can wait. Right now she needs food and warmth. The housekeeper immediately shifted into practical mode, ushering them both inside, while muttering under her breath about folks who'd turn a child out in weather like this, and what this world was coming to. Junie found herself in an entryway that seemed impossibly vast, with a chandelier hanging overhead that held more candles than she'd seen in her entire life. Everything spoke of wealth beyond her comprehension, the polished wooden floors covered with thick rugs, the paintings on the walls depicting landscapes and stern-faced people in fine clothes, the carved banister of a staircase that curved upward toward mysteries she couldn't imagine. She stood frozen in the doorway, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of this place that Cole called home. "Come along, sweetheart," Martha said, noticing her hesitation. "Let's get you into some dry clothes and then see about putting some food in that thin belly of yours." But Junie didn't move. Instead, she turned to Cole with eyes that held a wisdom far beyond her years. "Mr. Maddox, sir, I appreciate the kindness, but I should tell you straight. I don't have any money to pay for all this. My bundle's got my mama's Bible and a spare dress that's more patches than cloth, but that's about the extent of my worldly goods." Cole knelt down until he was at her eye level, struck by the dignity with which she addressed her poverty. "Junie Ray, when did you last have a proper meal?" She considered this seriously. "Proper meal? Well, I had some cornbread yesterday, or maybe the day before. And I found some wild berries earlier that weren't too sour. Oh, and there was a creek with water that tasted clean enough." Martha made a sound that was half sob, half growl. "That settles it. Come along, child." And no more. Talk about payment. Some things in this world don't have a price on them. The kitchen was a revelation to Junie. A massive cast-iron stove that radiated blessed warmth, copper pots hanging from hooks like metallic fruit, and shelves lined with jars and tins that suggested abundance beyond anything she'd known. Martha immediately set about heating water for a bath while laying out ingredients for what promised to be the finest meal of Junie's life. Cole found himself watching the interplay between his housekeeper and the child with fascination. Martha, who had maintained respectful but distant politeness since Sarah's death, was transforming before his eyes into the nurturing woman he remembered from his daughter's early years. And Junie, despite her obvious exhaustion and weariness, was responding to Martha's gentle authority with cautious trust. "Now then," Martha said, producing a bar of lavender soap and a towel that looked softer than anything Junie had ever imagined. "Let's get you cleaned up while I heat some milk and start on that stew." Junie accepted the offered items, but remained, standing uncertainly in the middle of the kitchen. "Mum, I don't want to be a bother. If you could just point me toward a wash basin." "Wash basin, nothing," Martha declared firmly. "There's a proper bathtub upstairs, with hot water running right from the tap. You'll have a real bath if I have to carry you up there myself." The concept of hot water running from a tap was so foreign to Junie that she looked to Cole for confirmation that such marvels actually existed. His slight nod seemed to convince her that she hadn't fallen into some elaborate dream. While Martha prepared the bath, Cole found himself alone with the child in his kitchen for the first time. She stood near the stove, holding her small bundle and looking lost despite the warmth surrounding her. There was something about her stillness that reminded him painfully of Sarah in her last days, that quality of being present but somehow separate, as if part of her existed in a different world entirely. "Junie Ray," he said softly, "that bundle you're carrying, is it something special?" She looked down at the cloth-wrapped package, as if surprised to find it still in her arms. "It's my mama's Bible, mostly, and this." She carefully unwrapped one corner to reveal a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and worn soft from handling. "I drew this before we left our old place, when I could still remember their faces clear." Cole moved closer, drawn by something. In her voice, The paper contained a child's drawing in pencil, crude but unmistakably loving. Two figures stood in front of a small cabin, a man with kind eyes and a woman with long hair, both smiling. At the bottom, in careful childish letters, someone had written Mama and Papa Ray. They looked like good people, Cole said, his voice rough with emotion. They were the best people, Junie replied with quiet certainty. Papa could make anything grow, even in bad soil. And Mama sang while she worked, real pretty songs that made the whole house feel like Sunday morning. She rewrapped the drawing with reverent care, and Cole found himself thinking about the portrait that still hung above the mantel in his study. A formal family photograph taken just months before Rebecca died in childbirth. He'd looked at it every day for 10 years. But when had he last remembered Rebecca's laugh, or the way Sarah hummed while she played with her dolls? Martha's voice calling from upstairs interrupted his thoughts. "Bath's ready, sweetheart, come along now." As Junie followed Martha upstairs, Cole remained in the kitchen, staring at the spot where she'd shown him her treasured drawing. For 2 years, he'd preserved his grief like a sacred flame, keeping Sarah's room exactly as she'd left it, maintaining his daily rituals of remembrance and regret. But watching this small girl protect her own precious memories while facing an uncertain future with such courage, he began to wonder if there might be a difference between honoring the dead and being buried alongside them. The sound of gentle laughter drifted down from upstairs. Martha's delighted chuckle mixed with something that might have been Junie's first real moment of joy in weeks. Cole felt something shift in his chest, a sensation he'd almost forgotten. It took him a moment to recognize it as the possibility of hope, fragile and uncertain, but undeniably real. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the ranch house, something new was beginning to bloom in the spaces that grief had left. Empty. 3 days had passed since the storm, and the Circle M Ranch was settling into a new rhythm that none of its inhabitants could have predicted. Junie Ray moved through the vast house like a cautious ghost, touching nothing without permission, speaking only when spoken to, and maintaining the careful politeness of someone who understood that kindness could be withdrawn as easily as it was given. But Cole was beginning to notice small changes that suggested the child was healing in ways both physical and otherwise. The hollow shadows under her eyes were fading thanks to Martha's determined feeding campaign. Her movements were less cautious, more natural, and sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, he caught glimpses of the spirited child she must have been before tragedy reshaped her world. This morning, he found her sitting on the front porch steps in the early dawn light, her mother's Bible open in her lap. She wasn't reading, Cole suspected. Her education had been too sporadic for easy literacy, but rather studying the pressed flowers that someone had placed between its pages long ago. Delicate prairie roses and wild violets, now brown and brittle with age, marked passages that had once meant something to people she'd never known. "Early riser," he observed, settling beside her on the wide steps with his own cup of coffee steaming in the cool morning air. "Habit, I suppose," she replied, carefully closing the Bible and smoothing her hands over its worn cover. "Papa always said the best part of any day was watching it wake up." Cole studied her profile in the growing light. Someone had given her one of Sarah's old dresses, altered by Martha's skillful hands to fit her smaller frame. The soft blue fabric brought out the color of her eyes and made her look less like a waif and more like the child she should have been all along. "Tell me about your papa," he said gently. "What kind of man was he?" Junie's face brightened with the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "Papa was steady, I reckon. Not much for grand speeches or fancy words, but when he said something, you could count on it being true. He had these hands that could coax life out of the stubbornest ground, and he never once raised them in anger to anybody." She paused, her small fingers tracing patterns on the Bible's leather cover. "He used to say that every person was like a seed. You never knew what they might grow into if you gave them enough patience and the right conditions. Even the runts and the weak ones, he said, sometimes surprised you by turning into the strongest. Blanche in the garden, the simple wisdom in her father's words, hit Cole with unexpected force. He thought about his own approach to life since Sarah's death, the careful cultivation of isolation, the deliberate starvation of hope, the way he'd convinced himself that a heart that couldn't be broken again was somehow stronger than one that remained open to possibility. Sounds like a wise man, Cole said finally. He was. Junie's voice carried both pride and profound loss. Mama used to tease him that he talked more to his plants than he did to people, but I think maybe he understood growing things better than most folks understand anything. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun paint the Montana landscape in shades of gold and copper. The vastness of the territory stretched before them, broken only by distant mountains and the dark line of cottonwoods that marked the creek running through Cole's property. It was beautiful, in a way that could make a person feel both significant and utterly small at the same time. "Mr. Maddox," Junie said eventually, her voice careful and formal again, "I've been thinking about what comes next. I don't want to overstay my welcome, and I know a man like you has important business to attend." 2. Cole felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What kind of thinking?" "Well, I figure I'm strong enough now to make it to the next town. Martha's been feeding me up real good, and I've got my strength back mostly. I could probably find work. Somewhere. I'm small, but I'm a hard worker, and I don't eat much." The matter-of-fact way she discussed her uncertain future, as if a 9-year-old finding employment in frontier Montana was the most natural thing in the world, made Cole's hands clench around his coffee cup. The image of this child, barely recovered from exposure and abandonment, setting off alone again to find her own way in an unforgiving world, was more than he could bear. "What if I said I had a different idea?" he found himself asking. Junie turned to look at him with those two serious eyes. "What kind of idea?" Cole wasn't sure where the words were coming from, but they felt more right than anything he'd said in 2 years. "What if I said this ranch could use someone with your particular qualifications?" "My qualifications?" She sounded genuinely puzzled. "Well, you're clearly an expert on growing things, given your papa's teachings. And Martha's been complaining for years that this place needs someone young enough to appreciate her cooking properly. Plus, I've got a library full of books that haven't been read in far too long, and a piano that's been sitting silent since—" He paused, surprised by his own words. "Since it's been needing someone to bring it back to life." Junie stared at him with something approaching wonder. "Are you offering me a job, Mr. Maddox?" "I'm offering you a home, Junie Ray, if you want it." The words hung between them in the morning air, and Cole realized he meant them more completely than he'd meant anything since he'd promised Sarah he'd make her well again. This child, with her careful dignity and fierce independence, had somehow managed to crack open spaces in his heart he'd thought were sealed forever. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why would you want to do that for me?" Cole set down his coffee cup and looked out across the land that had been his pride and his prison for so many years. Maybe because sometimes a person finds exactly what they didn't know they were looking for. Maybe because this house has been too quiet for too long. Or maybe because your papa was right about seeds and growing conditions, and sometimes the most unexpected things can bloom if given half a chance. Junie was quiet for so long that Cole began to worry he'd overstepped, pushed too hard too fast. But when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, despite the tears he could see gathering in her eyes. "I think I'd like that very much, Mr. Maddox. But I should warn you, I don't know much about being part of a family. I might not be very good at it." Cole felt his own throat tighten with emotion he'd kept carefully locked away for far too long. "I think maybe we could learn together, if you're willing to be patient with an old man who's gotten out of practice." That evening, Cole found himself in his workshop for the first time since Sarah's death, his hands moving almost without conscious thought as they shaped a piece of pine into something that might, with patience and care, become a horse. He hadn't touched his carving tools in 2 years, but the familiar weight of the knife in his palm felt like greeting an old friend. As he worked, guided by instinct and half-remembered muscle memory, he could hear Martha and Junie in the kitchen, their voices blending in easy conversation, punctuated by occasional laughter. The sound filled spaces in the house that had been hollow for too long, and Cole found himself thinking that maybe healing wasn't about forgetting the past, but about finding room in your heart for the future alongside everything that had come before. The wooden horse took shape slowly under his careful hands, nothing fancy, just a simple toy carved with the kind of attention that transformed ordinary wood into something precious. When he was finished, he held it up to the lamplight, examining the smooth curves and gentle expression he'd somehow managed to coax from the grain. Tomorrow, he decided, he would give it to Junie, not as payment for staying, not as an obligation, or a bribe, but simply as the first gift in what he hoped would be a long series of ordinary miracles that might, with patience and the right conditions, grow into something neither of them had dared to hope for. Outside his workshop window, the Montana night stretched vast and full of possibilities, and for the first time in 2 years, Cole Maddox found himself looking forward to tomorrow. The wooden horse had been a revelation, both in the giving and the receiving. When Cole placed it in Junie's small hands that morning after their porch conversation, her face had transformed with a joy so pure it nearly brought him to his knees. She'd held the simple carving like it was crafted from gold, turning it over in her palms and examining every careful detail with the reverence of someone who understood that gifts freely given were the rarest treasures of all. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever owned," she'd whispered, and Cole had to step outside to compose himself, overwhelmed by the weight of trust and hope he saw in her eyes. Now, a week later, the horse never left her side. She carried it in the pocket of her dress during the day and placed it carefully on the nightstand beside her bed each evening, as if it were a talisman against the uncertainty that had defined her young life. Martha had sewn her a small bag to protect it, and even that simple kindness had brought tears to Junie's eyes. But it was Sunday morning that would test the true nature of their new arrangement. Cole stood before his wardrobe, staring at the black suit he hadn't worn since Sarah's funeral, wrestling with a decision that felt far more momentous than it should have. In Frontier, Montana, church attendance was as much about community standing as spiritual devotion, and bringing Junie to Sunday service would be tantamount to announcing to the entire territory that Cole Maddox had taken in an orphan child. Social implications were complex and potentially damaging. An unmarried man caring for a child who wasn't blood relation would raise eyebrows at best, outright scandal at worst. The wealthy cattle barons and their wives who formed Sweetwater Creek's social elite had long memories and sharp tongues, and Cole had no illusions about the whispered conversations that would follow their appearance together. But more troubling was the internal struggle the decision represented. Taking Junie to church meant stepping out of the protective isolation he'd maintained since Sarah's death. It meant facing the sympathetic looks and well-meaning questions he'd been avoiding. It meant acknowledging publicly that he was allowing himself to care about someone again, making himself vulnerable to the judgment and speculation of people who had watched him bury his heart alongside his daughter. A soft knock on his bedroom door interrupted his brooding. "Mr. Maddox." Junie's voice was carefully polite, as it always was when she sensed she might be intruding. "Martha says breakfast is ready, and she's wondering if you still mean to take me to church this morning." Cole opened the door to find her standing in the hallway, transformed once again by Martha's skilled alterations. The dress she wore had been Sarah's favorite, a soft lavender cotton with tiny pearl buttons and delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. On Sarah, it had been charming but unremarkable. On Junie, with her dark hair braided with ribbon and her solemn eyes reflecting both hope and uncertainty, it created an image that would be burned into Cole's memory forever. But it was more than Just the dress that stopped his breath. It was the way she held herself, straight-backed and dignified despite her obvious nervousness, ready to face whatever judgment awaited them with the same quiet courage she'd shown during her ordeal on the trail. She was, he realized, already braver than he was. "You look beautiful," he said simply, and watched her face bloom with a smile that made his decision for him. The ride to Sweetwater Creek's small white church took 45 minutes across rolling hills dotted with wildflowers and the occasional cluster of cattle bearing various brands. Junie sat beside him on the wagon seat, her small hands folded in her lap and her eyes wide as she took in the growing signs of civilization. Other wagons on the road, smoke rising from distant chimneys, the sound of a church bell carried on. "The morning breeze. I haven't been to proper church since before Mama and Papa died," she confided as they crested the hill that revealed the town spread out below them. "I hope I remember how to behave. Just follow my lead," Cole assured her, though privately he wondered if he remembered the social rituals any better than she did. "And remember, you belong here as much as anyone else." The words were as much for his own benefit as hers. As they approached the church, Cole could see other families gathering on the steps and in the small yard, their Sunday finest a testament to the prosperity that cattle ranching had brought to this corner of Montana territory. These were his peers and neighbors, people he'd done business with for years, but had held at arm's length since Sarah's death. William Thornton, who owned the second-largest spread in the territory, was deep in conversation with Judge Harrison about territorial politics. Mrs. Abernathy, the banker's wife and unofficial social arbiter of Sweetwater Creek, was organizing the ladies for their weekly discussion of charitable works and community concerns. Children ran between the groups, their laughter bright in the morning air as they played games that would have to end the moment they stepped inside the sanctuary. Cole felt Junie tense beside him as conversations gradually died and faces turned toward their approaching wagon. He could practically hear the mental calculations being made. Who was this child? Where had she come from? And what was Cole Maddox doing with her, dressed in what everyone would recognize as his late daughter's clothing? "Mr. Maddox!" Judge Harrison called out as Cole helped Junie down from the wagon, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man accustomed to navigating delicate social situations. "Good to see you joining us again. And who might this young lady be?" Before Cole could respond, Junie stepped forward with a dignity that belied her 9 years. "I'm Junie Ray, sir. Mr. Maddox has been kind enough to take me in." The simple statement contained volumes of information and raised twice as many questions. Mrs. Abernathy's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline, and Cole could see the rapid exchange of glances between the gathered adults as they processed this unexpected development. "Taken you in?" Mrs. Thornton repeated, her voice sharp with curiosity. "Are you perhaps a relation of Mr. Maddox?" "No, ma'am," Junie replied with perfect honesty. "I was orphaned recently, and Mr. Maddox found me on the trail during last week's storm. He and Miss Martha have been caring for me since." The murmur that rippled through the gathered crowd was audible, and Cole felt his jaw tighten as he recognized the mix of surprise, speculation, and judgment in the faces around them. He was acutely aware of how this must appear: a wealthy widower, a mysterious orphan child, an arrangement that defied conventional social boundaries. But then he looked down at Junie, saw the way she stood straight and proud despite the obvious scrutiny, and felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest. This child had survived abandonment, exposure, and loss with more grace than most adults could muster. She deserved better than whispered gossip and raised eyebrows from people who had never faced a tenth of the challenges she'd overcome. "That's right," Cole said clearly, his voice carrying across the churchyard with the authority that had made him one of the most respected men in 3 territories. "Junie is under my protection now, and I'll thank everyone to remember that she's to be treated with the same respect you'd show any member of my household." The implicit challenge in his words was unmistakable. In a community where Cole's economic influence touched nearly every family, either directly or indirectly, open criticism of his decisions carried risks that few were willing to take. But Cole knew that private conversations and subtle ostracism would be harder to combat than outright confrontation. It was then that an unexpected ally emerged from the crowd. Emma Fairchild, the territory's schoolteacher, stepped forward with a warm smile that seemed to cut through the tension like sunlight through storm clouds. "What a lovely dress, dear," she said to Junie, her voice carrying genuine kindness rather than the calculating politeness of the other women. "That color is perfect with your complexion. I do hope we'll be seeing you in school once you're settled. We can always use bright young minds in our classroom." The simple gesture of inclusion, offered without judgment or hidden agenda, seemed to break the spell of uncomfortable speculation that had gripped the gathering. Other voices began to join in, tentative offers of welcome, polite inquiries about Junie's background, the gradual resumption of normal social rhythms. As they filed into the small church for the service, Cole felt Junie's hand slip into his, not from fear or uncertainty this time, but from something that felt remarkably like trust. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever whispered conversations would follow them home, they would face them together. The service itself passed in a blur of familiar hymns and pastoral reflections on mercy and redemption. But Cole found his attention divided between the words from the pulpit and the small figure beside him, who followed along with the hymnal. Despite her limited reading skills, and bowed her head during prayers with a solemnity that spoke of genuine faith rather than mere social conformity. When the final blessing was pronounced and the congregation began to file out into the bright Montana morning, Cole knew that a line had been crossed. For better or worse, he had publicly claimed Junie as his own, bound their fates together in the eyes of a community that would remember this day long after the details of the sermon were forgotten. As they walked toward their wagon, Cole caught sight of Mrs. Abernathy in animated conversation with several other ladies, their heads bent together in the unmistakable posture of serious gossip. He also noticed Emma Fairchild approaching with determined steps, her expression suggesting she had something important to say. "Mr. Maddox," she called out, "might I have a word about Junie's education? I think we should discuss getting her properly enrolled in school as soon as possible." Cole felt something ease in his chest as he recognized the practical kindness in the teacher's offer. Whatever storms might be brewing in the social circles of Sweetwater Creek, there were still good people willing to see past convention to the needs of a child who deserved every chance to build a better future. "I'd be grateful for that conversation, Miss Fairchild," he replied, and meant it more than she could possibly know. The week following their church appearance brought consequences that rippled through Cole's carefully ordered world like stones thrown into still water. By Tuesday, 3 of his regular business associates had found reasons to postpone scheduled meetings. By Wednesday, Mrs. Abernathy had paid an unexpected social call that lasted precisely 15 minutes and consisted entirely of thinly veiled inquiries about Junie's true parentage and suggestions that proper arrangements might be made through territorial authorities. By Thursday, Cole found himself facing the most direct challenge yet to his decision when Henry Blackwood arrived unannounced at the Circle M, his silver-trimmed carriage and matched bay horses announcing his presence long before he reached the front porch. Blackwood owned more land than any other man in Montana Territory, had been instrumental in bringing the railroad through the region, and possessed the kind of political influence that could make or break smaller ranches. He was also a man who believed that social order required everyone to know their place and stay in it. Cole met him on the front porch, deliberately choosing not to invite him inside, where Junie might overhear their conversation. Martha was currently helping the child with her letters in the kitchen, and Cole had no intention of exposing her to whatever Henry Blackwood had come to say. "Henry," he said with carefully neutral politeness, "unexpected pleasure." Blackwood removed his hat, but remained standing, a sign that he considered this a brief, business-like visit rather than a social call. "Cole, I trust you won't mind if I speak plainly. I've never known you to do otherwise." "Good." Blackwood's pale eyes surveyed the ranch with the calculating gaze of a man who measured everything in terms of profit and loss. "There's talk in town about your recent acquisition. Some of the territory's leading families are expressing concern about the precedent being set." Cole felt his jaw tighten. Precedent? A wealthy, unmarried man taking in an unrelated child under circumstances that are at best irregular. "You can see how this might be viewed as inappropriate, regardless of your intentions." "My intentions," Cole said slowly, "are to provide a home for an orphaned child who had nowhere else to go. I fail to see how that could be viewed as anything but charitable." Blackwood's smile was thin and humorless. "Charity is admirable, Cole, but there are proper channels for such things. The territorial authorities have procedures for dealing with orphaned children, families with suitable credentials, who might provide more appropriate environments." The implication was clear. People like Henry Blackwood, with his wife and 3 adult children, his unassailable social standing and conventional family structure. People unlike Cole, who carried the double burden of being both unmarried and tainted by the kind of devastating loss that made others uncomfortable. "And if I were to refuse to surrender Junie to these proper channels?" Cole asked, his voice deceptively calm. "That would be unfortunate." Blackwood replaced his hat with deliberate precision. "The Cattlemen's Association has been discussing the upcoming territorial contracts for beef supply to the railroad. Your name was mentioned, of course, given the size of your operation, but questions were raised about the stability of potential suppliers. Men who make questionable personal decisions might be viewed as unreliable business partners." The threat was delivered with the same matter-of-fact tone one might use to discuss the weather, but its implications were staggering. The railroad. Contracts represented the difference between prosperity and ruin for every major ranch in the territory. Losing access to that market would force Cole to sell cattle at severely reduced prices to smaller local buyers, crippling his operation. Within a few seasons. "I see," Cole said finally, "and I suppose the resolution to these concerns would involve my cooperation in transferring Junie to a more suitable situation. The Territorial Child Welfare Board meets next month in Helena. Judge Harrison has agreed to chair the proceedings. I'm sure a man of your standing could present a compelling case for why temporary arrangements should be made permanent through proper legal channels. With the right endorsements, of course." Cole studied the older man's face, reading the calculation behind his pale eyes. This wasn't about Junie's welfare or social propriety. This was about power and control, about ensuring that men like Henry Blackwood remained the arbiters of what was acceptable in their carefully ordered world. But there was something else at work here, something that spoke to deeper fears about change and the shifting nature of frontier society. Cole represented a different kind of wealth and influence. Newer money, fewer social connections, a man who had built his empire through skill and determination rather than inherited advantage. His decision to act outside conventional channels threatened the established order in ways that went far beyond a single orphaned child. "I appreciate you making the situation so clear, Henry," Cole said finally. "I'll certainly give it the consideration it deserves." Blackwood's smile suggested he believed he'd achieved his objective. "I knew you'd see reason, Cole. After all, we're all working toward the same goals: stability, prosperity, maintaining the values that have made our territory such a success." After Blackwood's carriage disappeared down the long drive, Cole remained on the porch, staring out at land that had been his kingdom just a week ago, and now felt suddenly fragile. The sound of laughter drifted from the kitchen. Junie's bright giggle mixing with Martha's delighted chuckle as they worked through the mysteries of spelling and penmanship. He thought about the legal documents locked in his study safe, including the papers that detailed Sarah's trust fund. money that had been set aside for his daughter's future and had remained untouched since her death. The fund was substantial enough to provide security for Junie's entire life, ensuring her education, her independence, her freedom to choose her own path. But it would require formal adoption papers to transfer those rights, and formal adoption would require the approval of territorial authorities who were clearly prepared to question his fitness as a guardian. The irony was bitter. Cole Maddox could buy and sell most of the men who sat in judgment of him, could trace his lineage back to Revolutionary War heroes, had built an empire from nothing through honest work and fair dealing. But because he was unmarried, because his household didn't conform to conventional expectations, because he'd chosen compassion over protocol, he was suddenly viewed as unsuitable to care for a child who had been literally thrown away by her blood relatives. That evening, after Junie had gone to bed with her wooden horse clutched against her chest and her mother's Bible on the nightstand beside her, Cole sat in his study with a glass of whiskey and the deed to Sarah's trust fund spread before him on his desk. The legal language was dense and formal, but the core message was simple. Upon Sarah's death, the funds were to revert to Cole's control until such time as he designated another heir. Modifying the deed to include Junie would require the approval of Judge Harrison and the territorial court, the same men who were now questioning his judgment and moral fitness. It would mean exposing his financial affairs to scrutiny, subjecting his private grief to public examination, risking not just his own reputation, but Junie's future security. But as he sat there in the lamplight, surrounded by the accumulation of 20 years of hard work and careful planning, Cole realized that none of it mattered if he couldn't protect the one person who had somehow managed to crack open his carefully guarded heart. A soft knock on his study door interrupted his brooding. "Come in," he called, expecting Martha with her nightly report on household matters. Instead, Junie appeared in the doorway, her dark hair hanging loose around her shoulders and her feet bare beneath her white nightgown. She looked impossibly young and vulnerable, but her eyes held the same steady determination he'd seen when she stood alone on that desolate trail. "I couldn't sleep," she said simply. "I keep thinking about the way those people looked at us after church, and I'm worried that I'm causing you trouble." Cole felt his heart clench at the matter-of-fact way she accepted responsibility for adult problems that should never have touched her young life. "Junie, whatever troubles I might be facing have nothing to do with you and everything to do with small-minded people who've forgotten what matters most in this world." She padded across the thick carpet to stand beside his chair, her small hand resting lightly on his arm. "Martha told me about your daughter, Sarah. She said you loved her more than anything, and that losing her nearly broke your heart clean in two." Cole's throat tightened, but he found he could speak about Sarah more easily with Junie than he'd been able to with anyone else. "She was the light of my life. Losing her felt like losing the sun." "I know that feeling," Junie said quietly. "When Mama and Papa died, I thought the whole world had gone dark forever. But then you found me on that trail, and Martha started feeding me her good soup, and you made me that beautiful horse." She paused, her young face serious with concentration. "I think maybe love doesn't die when people do. Maybe it just waits around for the right person to give it to." The simple wisdom in her words hit Cole like a physical blow. This child, who had lost everything and been abandoned by the only family she had left, was offering him comfort and insight that all the sympathy calls and well-meaning advice from adults had failed to provide. "Junie," he said slowly, "if people try to say that you don't belong here, that you should go somewhere else, they can say whatever they want," she interrupted with quiet fierceness. "I know where I belong now. This is my home, and you're my family, and nobody gets to tell us different unless we let them." Cole looked into her determined young face and felt something settle in his chest, a resolve that had been building since The moment he'd found her on that storm-swept trail, whatever battles lay ahead, whatever social pressures or legal challenges or business consequences he might face, they would meet them together. In that case, he said, carefully folding the trust fund documents and placing them back in the safe, I think it's time we made our arrangement official. How would you feel about becoming Junie Ray Maddox in the eyes of the law as well as in our hearts? Her smile was brighter than all the electric lights they were starting to install in the fancy houses back east, and Cole knew that whatever the cost, he would pay it gladly for the privilege of keeping that light burning in his world. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in late June, carried by young Tom Henderson on his weekly mail run from Helena. Martha signed for it with the casual efficiency of someone accustomed to handling Cole's correspondence, but something about the yellow paper's formal weight and the Chicago return address made her pause before carrying it to his study. Cole was reviewing quarterly cattle reports when she knocked, her usual confident demeanor replaced by an uncertainty that immediately caught his attention. In the month since Junie's arrival, Martha had transformed from dutiful housekeeper into something approaching her old maternal self, and seeing her rattled sent alarm bells through his consciousness. "This came for you," she said, holding out the telegram as if it might bite. "It's from Chicago, and it's marked urgent." Cole accepted the yellow paper with growing unease. In his experience, urgent telegrams rarely brought good news, and the timing felt particularly ominous, given his recent conversations with Henry Blackwood and the territorial authorities about Junie's situation. The message was brief, but devastating. Urgent, seeking information regarding Junie Ray Mitchell, age 9, orphaned, Montana Territory. Have reason to believe child is my deceased sister's daughter. Will arrive Sweetwater Creek, July 15th, to claim custody. Contact immediately if child. In your care. Victoria Ashworth, 1247 Lakeshore Drive, Chicago. Cole read the telegram 3 times before its implications fully registered. The paper seemed to grow heavier in his hands with each reading, transforming from mere words into a weapon capable of destroying everything he and Junie had built together over the past weeks. "Bad news?" Martha asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. "The worst kind," Cole replied, his voice hollow. "Junie has family in Chicago, wealthy family by the address, and they're coming to take her away." The sound that escaped Martha's throat was half sob, half growl of maternal fury. "That child has been through enough. She's finally found peace. Here finally started to heal, and now some stranger from Chicago thinks they can just swoop in, and they're not strangers," Cole interrupted gently. "If this Victoria Ashworth is telling the truth, she's Junie's aunt. Her legal claim would supersede anything I might argue in territorial court." The cruel irony wasn't lost on him. Just as he'd found the courage to pursue formal adoption, just as he'd decided to risk everything to make Junie legally his daughter, her blood family had emerged from whatever shadows had hidden them during her months of suffering and abandonment. Martha settled heavily into the chair across from his desk, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she processed the implications. "What do we tell her?" It was the question Cole had been dreading. How did you explain to a child who had finally found safety and love that it might all be taken away by legal technicalities and family obligations she'd never known existed? How? Did you prepare a 9-year-old for the possibility that the home she'd begun to trust might be temporary after all? "We tell her the truth," Cole said finally. "She deserves that much, at least." They found Junie in the kitchen garden, carefully tending the small plot Martha had given her to plant, with seeds saved from her parents' final harvest. She'd been working the soil with the patient attention her father had taught her, and already tiny green shoots were emerging in neat rows that spoke of knowledge passed down through generations of people who understood the sacred relationship between seed and earth. She looked up as they approached, her face bright with pride and accomplishment. "Look, Mr. Maddox!" The carrots are starting to come up, just like Papa said they would. And Martha thinks the beans might be ready to pick by the end of the month. The simple joy in her voice made what Cole had to say infinitely more difficult. He crouched down beside her small garden, noting the careful spacing of the rows, and the gentle way she'd mounded soil around each emerging plant. "Junie," he began carefully, "we need to talk about something important, something that might change things for us." Her hands stilled on the small weeding tool Martha had found for her, and Cole watched wariness creep back into her eyes. The same defensive alertness he'd seen that first night on the trail. "What kind of change?" Cole showed her the telegram, reading it aloud, slowly and clearly, so she could understand every word. As he spoke, he watched her face cycle through confusion, recognition, fear, and finally a kind of resigned sadness that no child should have to feel. "So I have an aunt," she said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "Mama never talked about her much, but I remember the name Victoria. Mama used to say she'd gone to the big city and forgotten where she came from. Do you remember anything else about her?" Junie was quiet for a long moment, her small fingers absently smoothing the soil around a carrot sprout. "Mama said Victoria was smart and pretty and wanted things Mama couldn't understand. Said she married a rich man and never looked back." She paused, then added with devastating insight, "I guess she must not have known Mama and Papa were dead, or she would have come for me before now." The matter-of-fact way she accepted this latest upheaval in her young life broke Cole's heart. This child had learned to expect disappointment, to guard against hope, to prepare for loss even in moments of happiness. The fact that she could discuss the potential destruction of her newfound security with such calm resignation spoke to survival skills no 9-year-old should need to develop. "What happens now?" she asked, looking up at him with eyes that held too much understanding of the world's cruelties. "She's coming here in 3 weeks to meet you," Cole said. "After that, we'll see what the territorial courts decide about where you belong." "And if they decide I belong with her?" Cole felt his throat close around words he couldn't bring himself to speak. The legal reality was stark and unforgiving. Blood relations had rights that superseded the emotional bonds formed between strangers, no matter how genuine those bonds might be. If Victoria Ashworth could prove her relationship to Junie and demonstrate her ability to provide proper care, no court in the territory would side with an unmarried cattle rancher against a child's aunt. "Then I suppose," he said finally, "we'll have to let you go." The words felt like poison in his mouth, a betrayal of every promise he'd made to protect her and keep her safe. But Junie seemed to understand the constraints they faced better than he'd hoped. "I see," she said quietly. Then, with a small smile that nearly destroyed him, "Well, at least I got to have a real family for a little while. That's more than some people ever get." That evening, after Junie had gone to bed, Cole sat alone in his study with a bottle of whiskey and the growing realization that loving someone meant accepting the possibility of losing them. The telegram lay on his desk like an indictment, its yellow paper catching the lamplight in a way that seemed to mock his presumption in thinking he could build a new life from the ashes of his old one. 3 weeks. 21 days to prepare for the arrival of a woman who had every legal right to take away the child who had somehow become the center of his world. 21 days to help Junie understand that the aunt who was coming for her might offer opportunities and advantages that a Montana ranch could never provide. 21 days to convince himself that letting her go might be the most loving thing he could do. But as he sat there in the gathering darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of his house settling around him, Cole found himself thinking not about legal rights or social advantages, but about a small garden where carrots were sprouting in careful rows and a wooden horse that slept every night on a child's nightstand. Some things, he realized, were worth fighting for, regardless of the odds. And if Victoria Ashworth thought she could simply appear after months of Junie's suffering and claim the right to tear apart a family that had been forged in love and loss, she was about to discover that Cole Maddox hadn't built his empire by surrendering easily to anyone's demands. The battle for Junie's future was about to begin, and Cole intended to fight it with everything he had. The 3 weeks that followed the telegram's arrival transformed the Circle M ranch from a place of healing into a fortress preparing for siege. Cole threw himself into legal preparation with the same single-minded determination that had built his cattle empire, consulting with every lawyer between Helena and Sweetwater Creek while quietly gathering evidence of Junie's care and his fitness as a guardian. But it was the small daily moments that revealed the true depth of what they stood to lose. Junie's reading lessons with Martha had progressed to simple stories, and her proud recitation of The Tortoise and the Hare on Tuesday evening brought tears to both adults' eyes. Her garden flourished under her patient care, the neat rows of vegetables a testament to her father's teachings and her own determined hope for a future that might include harvest time. Most telling of all was the way she'd begun to trust, not just the adults who cared for her, but the very concept of permanence itself. She'd asked Martha to teach her to darn socks, explaining with 9-year-old logic that she wanted to be useful to her family. She'd begun talking about next year's garden, wondering aloud if they might try planting apple trees come spring. Each small gesture of faith in their shared future made the approaching confrontation more painful and more necessary. Emma Fairchild proved to be an unexpected ally in their preparations. The schoolteacher had spent considerable time with Junie over the past weeks, assessing her educational needs and quickly recognizing the sharp intelligence hidden beneath the child's careful politeness. When Cole confided the situation during one of Emma's evening visits, her response was immediate and fierce. "That child has been through enough upheaval," she declared, her usually gentle demeanor replaced by protective fury. "She's finally begun to blossom here, to trust again, to believe in tomorrow. Anyone who would tear her away from this stability for their own convenience doesn't understand the first thing about what children truly need." Emma's offer to testify on Cole's behalf at any custody proceedings was gratifying, but Cole knew that community support, while valuable, might not be enough to overcome the legal advantages of blood relation and Chicago wealth. Victoria Ashworth's resources could hire the finest lawyers in the territory, could present arguments about educational opportunities and social advantages that a Montana ranch couldn't match. It was Doc Patterson who provided both the most sobering assessment of their situation and the most crucial piece of strategic advice. The elderly physician had delivered half the babies in 3 territories and had seen enough family disputes to understand the legal and emotional complexities they faced. "Blood matters in territorial law," he told Cole bluntly during one of his weekly visits. "Courts assume family members know best, especially when they can provide financial security and social respectability. But," he added with a meaningful look, "courts also consider the child's own wishes, particularly when that child has experienced trauma and abandonment. You think Junie's testimony could make a difference? I think a 9-year-old who can articulate her own needs and preferences, who can demonstrate the healing that's taken place here, might give Judge Harrison something to consider beyond legal technicalities." Doc Patterson's weathered hands gestured toward the window where Junie could be seen carefully watering her garden with Martha's guidance. "That child was half dead when you found her, Cole. Look at her now. Sometimes the strongest argument is simply the evidence of your own eyes." The suggestion that Junie might need to testify in court about her preferences sent cold dread through Cole's stomach. The idea of subjecting her to formal legal proceedings, of forcing her to choose between the aunt she'd never known and the man who'd saved her life, felt like another form of abandonment. But when he tentatively broached the subject with Junie herself, her response surprised him with its calm determination. If it means I get to stay here with you and Martha, then I'll talk to any judge they want, she said simply. I'm not afraid of telling the truth about what happened to me or about what this place means. Her courage shamed him. Here was a child who had already survived more than most adults ever faced, and she was prepared to stand up in court and fight for the family she'd chosen. The least he could do was match her bravery with his own. The preparations intensified. As July 15th approached, Cole consulted with territorial lawyers about adoption procedures and parental rights. He gathered testimonies from ranch hands about Junie's adjustment and well-being. He even swallowed his pride and approached several prominent families for character references, enduring the subtle questions and raised eyebrows that came with asking for support in such an unconventional situation. But it was the evening ritual of going through Sarah's belongings that proved most significant in their preparation. Cole had avoided his daughter's room since her death, but something about the approaching crisis drove him to finally open that closed door and confront the shrine he'd made of her memory. Martha and Junie found him there on a Thursday evening, sitting on Sarah's small bed with a wooden box in his lap, his face wet with tears he'd held back for 2 years. The box contained letters, dozens of them written in Sarah's careful script during the final months of her illness, when she'd been too weak for much else. She wrote these for me, Cole said, his voice thick with emotion. One for every birthday I'd have after she was gone, one for Christmas, one for when I got married again, one for when I had more children. He held up a sealed envelope with shaking hands. This one says, for when Papa needs to remember what love really means. Junie approached slowly, her small hand resting gently on his arm. Maybe she knew you'd need to read it someday. With trembling fingers, Cole opened the envelope and unfolded the letter written in his daughter's beloved handwriting. Dear Papa, if you're reading this, it means you're sad again, and maybe forgetting that love isn't something that gets used up. Mama used to tell me that love is like the stars. Even when you can't see them all, they're still there shining. I know you miss me, but I don't want you to be alone forever. If God sends you someone else to love, that doesn't mean you love me any less. It just means your heart is big enough for more than one person, like how I loved you and Mama and Martha and that little calf with the white spot. Be happy, Papa. That's what I want most of all. Your daughter, always, Sarah. The letter represented everything Cole had been afraid to face since Sarah's death. The possibility that love could expand rather than diminish. That honoring his daughter's memory might mean opening his heart rather than closing it forever. Reading her words in front of Junie felt like receiving permission he hadn't known he needed. She sounds like she was wonderful, Junie said quietly, studying the careful handwriting with the reverence she showed for all precious things. She was, Cole replied, carefully refolding the letter, and she would have loved you very much. The simple exchange seemed to unlock something in all three of them. Martha began sharing stories of Sarah's mischievous side, the pranks and adventures that had made her more than just the angelic invalid of Cole's guilty memories. Junie listened with rapt attention, asking questions that showed her genuine desire to know about the sister she'd never meet. As they sat together in Sarah's room, surrounded by the carefully preserved artifacts of a child's interrupted life, Cole realized that Victoria Ashworth's arrival represented more than just a legal challenge. It was a test of whether the healing they'd accomplished together was strong enough to survive external pressure, whether the family they'd built from grief and hope could withstand the scrutiny of a world that valued convention over love. The next morning, Cole did something he hadn't done since Sarah's funeral. He strapped on his father's ivory-handled Colt revolver, the same gun that had protected 3 generations of Maddox men as they carved their place from the wilderness. Not because he expected violence, but because some battles required a man to present himself armed with every symbol of his determination to protect what mattered most. When Victoria Ashworth's fancy carriage arrived from Helena on the afternoon of July 15th, Cole was waiting on his front porch, with Junie beside him and Martha flanking them both like a protective guardian angel. Whatever this woman had come to demand, whatever legal papers she carried or threats she intended to make, she would find them ready. The time for preparation was over. The fight for Junie's future was about to begin, and Cole Maddox intended to meet it with everything he had learned about love, loss, and the courage required to defend both. Victoria Ashworth descended from her hired carriage like a queen surveying conquered territory, her silk travelling dress and feathered hat marking her as unmistakably Eastern wealth transplanted into the rough frontier landscape. She was perhaps 40 years old, with the kind of polished beauty that spoke of professional care and expensive cosmetics, but her eyes held a calculating coldness that made Cole's protective instincts flare immediately. "Mr. Maddox, I presume," she said, her voice carrying the cultured tones of Chicago society. "I am Victoria Ashworth. I believe you have something that belongs to me." The casual dismissal in her words, referring to Junie as a possession rather than a person, told Cole everything he needed to know about this woman's priorities. Beside him, he felt Junie stiffen, her small hand instinctively reaching for his. As she faced the aunt she'd heard about but never met, "Mrs. Ashworth," Cole replied with careful politeness, "I have Junie Ray, who has been under my care for the past 2 months. I understand you claim to be her relation." "Claim?" Victoria's eyebrows rose with aristocratic disdain. "I am Eleanor Mitchell's elder sister. Junie is my deceased sister's child, which makes her my responsibility under both moral and legal authority." She produced a leather portfolio from her reticule, withdrawing official-looking documents with the confidence of someone accustomed to having paperwork solve her problems. "I have birth certificates, marriage records, and correspondence proving my relationship to Eleanor and, by extension, to this child. I also have a court order from Cook County, Illinois, granting me temporary custody pending territorial proceedings." Cole examined the papers with growing unease. The documentation appeared legitimate, complete with official seals and notarized signatures. Victoria Ashworth had come prepared for legal warfare, armed with the kind of resources that could overwhelm. A territorial court already inclined to favor blood relations over emotional bonds. "Now then," Victoria continued, turning her attention to Junie, with the same appraising look she might give a questionable piece of merchandise, "you must be Eleanor's daughter. My goodness, you do look like her, don't you? Although rather rustic. We'll need to do something about that." Junie stepped slightly behind Cole's protective bulk, her free hand clutching the small bag that contained her wooden horse. "Yes, ma'am, I'm Junie Ray. Well, we'll start with proper names. Juniper Raylin Ashworth has a much more suitable ring for Chicago society than whatever frontier nickname you've been using." Victoria's smile was sharp and dismissive. "You'll find life quite different in a proper household, my dear. Real schools, cultured companions, opportunities your poor mother could never have provided." In these circumstances, the casual erasure of Junie's chosen identity, the dismissive reference to her parents' humble life, the assumption that wealth automatically equated to superior care, all of it crystallized Cole's growing conviction that this woman saw Junie as a project to be improved, rather than a child to be loved. "Mrs. Ashworth," Martha interjected with barely controlled fury, "perhaps you'd like to come inside and discuss this properly, rather than conducting family business on the front porch." Victoria's gaze swept over Martha with the kind of dismissive assessment reserved for hired help. "I think not. This won't take long. I've arranged accommodations in town for the night, and I intend to depart with Juniper tomorrow morning on the early stage to Helena." "Tomorrow?" Cole's voice carried a dangerous edge. "You expect to simply arrive and take a child away from the only stability she's known in months?" "I expect to reclaim my sister's daughter from an irregular situation that should never have been allowed to continue this long." Victoria's tone grew sharper, revealing steel beneath the cultured veneer. Really, Mr. Maddox, while I'm sure your intentions were charitable, surely you can see that an unmarried man caring for an unrelated child raises questions about propriety and appropriate supervision. The implication in her words was unmistakable, and Cole felt his hands clench into fists. This woman was prepared to question not just his fitness as a guardian, but his very character and motives. The suggestion that his care for Junie might be somehow inappropriate was both insulting and strategically calculated to undermine any custody arguments he might make. "My care for Junie has been witnessed by this entire community," Cole said slowly, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that had made him one of the most respected men in 3 territories. "Dr. Patterson can attest to her physical and emotional recovery. Miss Fairchild can speak to her educational progress. Every person in Sweetwater Creek has seen her transformation from a half-starved, abandoned child to a healthy, happy young girl. Yes, well, frontier standards of care may differ from what I consider adequate." Victoria's dismissive wave encompassed the entire ranch, reducing Cole's life's work to provincial inadequacy. "Juniper will have the finest tutors in Chicago, exposure to art and music and literature, social connections that will serve her throughout her life. Surely even you can see that emotion is no substitute for genuine opportunity." It was then that Junie stepped forward, her young voice cutting through the adult posturing with startling clarity. "Excuse me, ma'am, but what happened to my parents?" "Things, their clothes and furniture and Papa's tools." Victoria looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "Things? Oh, you mean their possessions. I assume the relatives who were caring for you disposed of whatever had value. Why would you ask about such matters?" "Because Papa's tools were good ones, and Mama's quilts took her years to make, and they had a music box that played Mama's favorite. A song." Junie's voice remained steady, but Cole could hear the pain beneath her careful words. "Did anyone save anything for me?" "My dear child, you can't possibly imagine I would clutter my home with frontier memorabilia. You'll have much finer things in Chicago. Proper furniture, fashionable clothing, everything a young lady of good family deserves." The casual dismissal of her parents' memory, the reduction of their life's work to frontier memorabilia, hit Junie like a physical blow. Cole watched her small shoulders sag as she realized that this woman, her blood relative, her supposed savior, had no interest in preserving the connections that mattered most to a grieving child. "I see," Junie said quietly. Then, with devastating directness, "And what happened to Patches?" "Patches? My dog. He was Papa's best cattle dog, but when Papa got sick, Patches wouldn't leave his side. The relatives said they'd take care of him when they took me in." Victoria's irritated sigh revealed everything. "I'm sure some arrangement was made. Really, Juniper, you must learn to focus on the future rather than dwelling on the past." Sentimental. Attachments to animals and objects only hold one back from proper advancement. Cole felt something cold and furious settle in his chest as he watched this conversation destroy whatever small hope Junie might have harbored about her aunt's arrival. This woman had made no effort to preserve anything of value from her sisters. Life had shown no interest in the emotional needs of a grieving child, and was now dismissing those very real losses as obstacles to proper advancement. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said with carefully controlled anger, "Junie has been through tremendous trauma and loss. She needs stability, continuity, people who understand that healing takes time and patience. What she needs," Victoria replied sharply, "is proper guidance from family members who can provide appropriate opportunities. Not misguided attachment to a temporary situation that was never meant to be permanent." It was Martha who delivered the final blow to Victoria's assumptions about easy victory. "Ma'am, perhaps you should know that Junie has written a letter about her preferences regarding custody. Judge Harrison has agreed to consider her testimony as part of any legal proceedings." Victoria's composed mask slipped for the first time, revealing genuine surprise and displeasure. Testimony? She's a child. What possible relevance could her Preferences have to legal matters of guardianship? In territorial law, Cole said with quiet satisfaction, the preferences of children over 7 years of age are considered relevant evidence in custody disputes, particularly when those children have experienced abandonment or trauma. The small bag containing Junie's wooden horse seemed to grow heavier in her hands as she looked between the adults discussing her fate. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a maturity that belied her 9 years. I wrote the letter because I wanted people to understand what it feels like to have a real family again, she said simply. And I wanted them to know the difference between someone who saves you and someone who just wants to fix you up like a broken toy. Victoria Ashworth's sharp intake of breath suggested she understood exactly what that distinction meant for her carefully planned custody claim. The battle for Junie's future had begun in earnest, and the first shots had not gone according to the Chicago woman's expectations. The territorial courthouse in Sweetwater Creek had never hosted a custody hearing quite like this one. By 9:00 on the morning of July 16th, every seat in the small courtroom was filled with ranchers, townspeople, and curious onlookers drawn by the unusual nature of the proceedings. Word had spread through the community about the wealthy Chicago woman who'd come to claim Cole Maddox's adopted daughter, and public opinion was divided along lines that reflected deeper tensions about progress, tradition, and what constituted a proper family. Judge Harrison, a practical man in his 60s who'd spent 20 years settling disputes in frontier territory, called the proceedings to order with the weary air of someone who understood that legal questions often had no perfect answers. He'd reviewed the preliminary documents from both parties, and his weathered face revealed nothing of his initial impressions. This court will hear arguments regarding the custody of Junie Ray Mitchell, currently residing with Mr. Cole Maddox under informal guardianship arrangements, he announced. Mrs. Victoria Ashworth petitions for custody based on family relationship and legal standing. Mr. Maddox contests this petition based on the child's established residence and expressed preferences. Victoria's attorney, a sharp-faced man imported from Helena for the occasion, rose to present her case with the polished confidence of someone accustomed to territorial courtrooms. His arguments were methodical and legally sound. Blood relation took precedence over emotional attachment. Wealthy relatives could provide superior opportunities, and unmarried men were inherently unsuitable as guardians for young girls, regardless of their good intentions. Your Honor, the lawyer concluded, while we acknowledge Mr. Maddox's charitable impulses in providing temporary shelter, the law is clear about family obligations and appropriate placement. Mrs. Ashworth offers this child legitimate family, connection, financial security, educational opportunities, and social advantages that simply cannot be matched by an irregular arrangement in frontier Montana. The presentation was effective and professionally delivered, touching on legal precedents and social conventions that carried weight in territorial law. Cole felt his stomach tighten as he listened to his relationship with Junie reduced to charitable impulses and irregular arrangements, as if 2 months of healing and love could be dismissed as well-meaning but ultimately inappropriate sentiment. But it was when Victoria herself took the stand that the true nature of her motivations began to emerge under questioning from Cole's attorney, a local man named Samuel Brooks, who'd built his practice on common sense rather than legal sophistication. Mrs. Ashworth, Brooks began mildly, can you tell the court about your relationship with your sister Eleanor during her lifetime? Victoria's composed expression flickered slightly. Eleanor and I corresponded regularly, of course. Family obligations. How? Regularly? When was the last time you saw her in person? Well, distance made visits impractical. Eleanor chose to live quite remotely, but we maintained contact through letters. Brooks produced a small stack of papers from his case. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence the complete correspondence between Mrs. Ashworth and her sister, covering the 5 years preceding Eleanor's death. A total of 4 letters, the last one dated 18 months before the fever outbreak that claimed both parents. The implications rippled through the courtroom. Victoria Ashworth had maintained virtually no contact with her sister during the final years of Eleanor's life, had made no effort to assist during the family's struggles, and had been unaware of their deaths until months after the fact. Mrs. Ashworth, Brooks continued, were you aware that your sister and her husband had been facing financial difficulties due to crop failures in 1885 and 1886? Frontier life involves certain hardships, naturally. Were you aware that Eleanor had written to you requesting assistance during their darkest period, and that her letter was returned unopened, with a note that you were no longer receiving correspondence from Montana Territory? Victoria's lawyer objected. But the damage was done. The woman, who now claimed urgent concern for Junie's welfare, had deliberately severed contact with her sister during the family's greatest need. It was then that Judge Harrison called Junie herself to testify, and the small girl walked to the witness stand with the same quiet dignity she'd shown throughout the crisis. Brooks had prepared her carefully for this moment, but as she began to speak, it became clear that her words came from her own heart rather than any adult coaching. "Your Honor," she said in her clear young voice, "I wrote a letter about what's happened to me because I thought maybe grown-ups might understand better if they read it, instead of just listening to other grown-ups argue about what's best for me." Judge Harrison accepted the carefully folded paper and read it silently, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful. When he finished, he looked down at Junie with something approaching wonder. "Would you like to tell the court about your life with Mr. Maddox?" "Well, sir, when he found me, I was pretty close to dying, I think. I hadn't eaten for days, and I was so tired I couldn't hardly walk anymore. But he took me home, and Miss Martha fed me soup, and they gave me a real bed with clean sheets, and nobody asked me to pay for anything or be grateful all the time or pretend to be someone different than who I am." She paused, her small hands folded carefully in her lap. "And Mr. Maddox, he listens when I talk about Mama and Papa. He doesn't tell me to forget them or get over being sad. He made me a horse that I can keep forever, and he's teaching me about running a ranch. And Miss Martha is teaching me to read real good. They make me feel like I matter, not like I'm a problem that needs fixing." Victoria's attorney attempted to redirect the testimony toward practical considerations: educational opportunities, social advantages, financial security. But Junie's responses revealed a wisdom that cut through legal technicalities to the heart of what children truly needed. "Mom asked me about schools and music lessons and fancy clothes," Junie said when questioned about Victoria's offers. "But she didn't ask me about my garden or whether I missed Mama's lullabies or if I still had nightmares about being left on that trail. She looked at me like I was a project she needed to finish instead of a person she wanted to know." The contrast between the two households became increasingly stark as Junie's testimony continued. Cole's home offered emotional healing, continuity with her past, and acceptance of her grief. Victoria's promised advantages came with the implicit demand that Junie abandon her identity and embrace a future disconnected from everything that had shaped her young life. When Judge Harrison asked about her preferences, Junie's answer was delivered with devastating simplicity. "Your Honor, I know Aunt Victoria is my blood family, and maybe she can give me things that cost more money than what I have now. But Mr. Maddox and Miss Martha, they gave me back my heart when I thought it was broken forever. That seems more important than fancy schools or big houses." The courtroom was absolutely silent as Junie returned to her seat beside Cole, her small hand slipping naturally into his larger one. Victoria Ashworth's face had gone pale, her earlier confidence replaced by the dawning realization that legal rights might not be enough to overcome the evidence of genuine love and healing that filled the room. Judge Harrison called a brief recess. to consider the testimony, and as the crowd filed out into the Montana sunshine, Cole found himself holding onto Junie's hand like a lifeline. Whatever the court decided, whatever legal obligations might prevail over emotional bonds, he knew that this child had already given him back something he'd thought was lost forever: the capacity to fight for love rather than simply endure its absence. The final verdict would come within the hour, and with it, the answer to whether justice could recognize that sometimes the families we choose prove stronger than the ones we inherit by accident of birth. Judge Harrison's return to the courtroom 20 minutes later was met with a silence so complete that the sound of his gavel seemed to echo through the entire territory. The weathered jurist had seen enough frontier justice to understand that some decisions shaped communities for generations, and the weight of that responsibility showed in every line of his face as he prepared to render his verdict. "In the matter of custody for Junie Ray Mitchell," he began, his voice carrying the measured authority of 2 decades on the territorial bench. "This court has considered the legal standing of both parties, the testimonies presented, and most importantly, the expressed wishes and observed welfare of the child in question." Cole felt Junie's small hand tighten in his, her 9-year-old composure holding firm despite the enormity of what hung in the balance. Across the courtroom, Victoria Ashworth sat rigid with barely contained expectation, her expensive attorney leaning forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to legal victories built on procedural advantages and social connections. "Mrs. Ashworth's claim of blood relation is legally valid and well documented," Judge Harrison continued, and Cole felt his heart sink toward his boots. "However, this court must also consider the circumstances that led to the current situation and the demonstrated capacity of each party to serve the child's best interests." The judge paused, his grey eyes moving to Junie with something approaching grandfatherly concern. "Miss Junie, your testimony today showed remarkable maturity and insight. You've helped this court understand that legal guardianship involves far more than financial provision or social advantage." Victoria's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the proceedings were not following the predictable path his experience had led him to expect. In frontier courts, blood relation and financial stability typically trumped emotional considerations, but something in Judge Harrison's tone suggested a different framework was being applied. The evidence shows that Mrs. Ashworth had minimal contact with her sister's family during their lifetime, and made no effort to assist during documented periods of hardship. Her sister's final letter, requesting help during the family's darkest hour, was returned unopened. This suggests a pattern of deliberate estrangement that raises questions about sudden claims of family obligation following tragedy. The words fell like hammer blows on Victoria's composed facade, each revelation undermining the foundation of her custody petition. Cole could see her attorney whispering urgent advice, but the damage to her credibility was already too comprehensive to repair. In contrast, Judge Harrison continued, Mr. Maddox's care for this child has been witnessed by an entire community. Dr. Patterson's medical testimony confirms remarkable physical and emotional recovery under his guardianship. Miss Fairchild's educational assessment shows significant academic progress. Most tellingly, the child herself has articulated clear preferences based on direct experience with both potential guardians. Junie's grip on Cole's hand relaxed slightly as hope began to creep back into her posture. Around them, the packed courtroom seemed to lean forward as a collective unit, sensing that the verdict was approaching a conclusion that might defy conventional expectations. While this court recognizes Mrs. Ashworth's legal standing as a blood relative, the evidence overwhelmingly demonstrates that Mr. Maddox has provided the stability, care, and emotional healing that serve this child's genuine best interests. The law exists to protect children, not to satisfy the convenience of adults who discover family obligations only after others have borne the burden of actual care. Victoria Ashworth's face had gone white with outrage and disbelief. Her attorney was already preparing objections and appeals, but Judge Harrison's next words cut through any hopes of immediate reversal. Therefore, this court awards permanent custody of Junie Ray Mitchell to Cole Maddox, with full authority to pursue formal adoption proceedings. Mrs. Ashworth's petition is denied, though reasonable visitation arrangements may be negotiated if both parties agree. The explosion of voices that followed, cheers from Cole's supporters, furious objections from Victoria's corner, the judge's gavel demanding order, faded into background noise as Cole looked down at Junie and saw tears of pure joy streaming down her face. "Does this mean I get to stay?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the courtroom chaos. "Forever," Cole replied, his own throat tight with emotion. "You're my daughter now, Junie Ray Maddox, in every way that matters." Victoria Ashworth's departure from Sweetwater Creek 3 hours later was as dramatic as her arrival had been calculating. Her hired carriage clattered away toward Helena in a cloud of dust and indignation, carrying with it threats of appeals and dire predictions about frontier justice. But her power to disrupt their lives was broken, reduced to empty bluster by a territorial judge who had chosen love over legal technicality. The celebration that evening at the Circle M Ranch was modest by some standards, but profound in its significance. Doc Patterson produced a bottle of genuine Kentucky bourbon that he'd been saving for special occasions. Emma Fairchild brought a cake decorated with carefully piped wildflowers. Martha cooked enough food to feed half the territory, and the house filled with neighbors and friends who had supported their unconventional family through its greatest crisis. But it was the quiet moment after the last guest had departed that revealed the true transformation their journey had accomplished. Cole found Junie in Sarah's old room, now officially her own, carefully arranging her few possessions on the dresser that had once held another little girl's treasures. The wooden horse sat in the place of honor, flanked by her mother's worn Bible and the carefully folded letter she had written for the judge. But there was something new as well, a small framed photograph that Martha had commissioned from the traveling photographer who passed through Sweetwater Creek each summer. "Look," Junie said proudly, holding up the formal portrait that showed the three of them, Cole, Martha, and herself, standing on the front porch of the ranch house. "Now I have a picture of my family too, just like you had of you and Miss Sarah." Cole studied the photograph, seeing not just the formal poses and careful clothing, but the genuine happiness in their faces, the sense of belonging that had replaced the careful politeness of their early days together. Somewhere in his transformation from grieving widower to protective father, he had found his way back to the kind of joy that could coexist with memory rather than being destroyed by it. "There's something else," he said, producing a legal document. From his vest pocket, Judge Harrison signed the adoption papers this afternoon. "You're officially Junie Ray Maddox now, with all the rights and privileges that come with the name." She examined the official papers with the same reverence she showed for all important documents, her finger tracing over the legal language that made their chosen family officially recognized by territorial law. "Does this mean I inherit the ranch someday?" she asked with 9-year-old practicality. "It means you inherit everything," Cole replied, "meaning far more than land or cattle or accumulated wealth. The name, the legacy, the responsibility to care for the people and places that matter. But mostly, it means you'll always have a home, no matter what else changes in this world." Outside, the Montana night stretched vast and full of stars, just as it had on that storm-swept evening when a broken man and an abandoned child had found each other on a desolate trail. But the ranch house no longer felt like a monument to loss. It had become what it was always meant to be, a home where love could take root and flourish, where healing could happen one careful day at a time, where families could be built from the most unlikely materials, In the months that followed, Junie's garden would yield its first full harvest. Her reading would progress to chapter books that she devoured with hungry enthusiasm, and her laughter would fill rooms that had been silent for too long. Cole would discover that fatherhood the second time around was different, but no less profound than his first experience. Seasoned by loss, but enriched by the knowledge of how precious and fragile such gifts truly were. But on this night, as he tucked his daughter into bed and watched her carefully place her wooden horse on the nightstand beside her mother's Bible, Cole Maddox knew that sometimes the most extraordinary journeys begin with the simple decision to stop running from love and start walking toward it, one careful step at a time. The little girl who had been left alone on a trail had found her way home at last. And in saving her, Cole had discovered that he had saved himself as well.